Good morning, Timberwolves. Mr. Robolino coming in with a virtual video going over the road to the Civil War. So make sure that you have your sheet that looks something like this. It is a chart that has the different events: Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law, Uncle Tom's Cabin, KansasNebraska Act, and Bleeding Kansas. Dred Scott versus Sanford, known as the Dred Scott decision, raid on Harpers Ferry, and the election of 1860. We're going to go through this slide, and we are going to go ahead and kind of explain how each of these was able to go ahead and lead to the fact that the South felt that they needed to separate from the Union because they felt that their livelihood, which is basically their agricultural economy, was in jeopardy of being lost. And as we know, the plantation system is going to be supported by slavery. So the southern colonies or the southern states were very adamant on protecting that lifestyle. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to go through each one. Be sure, if you need to, go ahead and pause it, rewind if you need to, or slow down the video to be able to keep up. Let's go ahead and let's get started. So as you can see, we are going to be kind of taking a look at the Missouri Compromise. So what we need to understand is the Missouri Compromise is a time when the United States is officially balanced in the United States. There are 11 northern states and 11 southern states. So inside of Congress, we see that there is a balance where we can say one region is not overpowering the other. As we remember, we are having that manifest destiny. People are moving west because of the territories being gained. If you remember, in 1803, the United States purchased lands from France called the Louisiana Territory. We know it as the Louisiana Purchase. Many people started moving out west. Now think about 1820. What is going on during that time? If you can go ahead and stop and ponder for a moment. Think about, where is Texas at this time? Texas is going to be under Spain's control. And then we start to see that there is going to be a revolution in Spain. Majority of the western part of the United States is under Spanish control and then eventually Mexican control. But the middle part of the United States is under the US control. And those are all territories that are not completely set up yet. Missouri, though, is, and Missouri begins to go ahead and get a certain amount of population, and they're growing bigger. Now, they want to be part of the United States, so they applied for statehood. But because of where they're located along the Mississippi River, they have a good agricultural basis. And if we know anything about agricultural basis, we know that they are going to need or support their livelihoods with slavery. So Missouri wants to come in as a slave state. The Southerners are very happy about this because that's going to be one more up in Congress to help them. Whereas the northern part, they're not going to like this very much because now they're going to have one below. So what we start to see is this brand new idea come about where Henry Clay, the compromiser, comes in. And what he's going to do is he is going to come up with a compromise that is going to benefit everybody. So Henry Clay comes in and he basically says, okay, if Missouri comes in as a slave state, we are going to go ahead and we're going to bring Maine in as a free state. Now, Maine at the time, as we know Maine, was part of Massachusetts. So what we did was we went ahead and we shrunk Massachusetts down, and then we went ahead and named it Maine. And because Maine is in the north, we went ahead and said, okay, we're going to be a free state. To continue to avoid any other issues within deciding of who's going to be free or slave, Henry Clay decides to go ahead and use this latitude line 3630. And from there, it just goes out and basically says, all right, if any state above this line, they will come in as a free state, but any state below the line, they will go ahead and be able to decide kind of where that is. The exception being Missouri. So if you can take a look, here is Missouri right here. Here's the 3630 line right here. So Missouri is above that line. But then you see anything below it is going to be slave. And here's Texas below that line. But then we have areas like Kansas, Nebraska, Michigan, Illinois. These are all above there. And take a look at the Louisiana Purchase. Look at this over here. This territory is going to want to come into the United States, but according to the 3630 line, they will come in as free states. And we're going to see how that's not really going to work really well. So let's go ahead and let's continue. So the Compromise of 1850 comes in, and you want to remember from 1820 to 1850, there's a lot of stuff happening. More states come in, and the Missouri Compromise is actually working. The states that are being inducted into the United States are following those rules. In 1836, the United States adopted Texas. Well, Texas became free, and then 1845, Texas became a state, and Texas came in as a slave state. As it came in as a slave state, Oregon came in as a free state, because that was the rule. For every slave state that comes in, a free state is going to follow to keep the balance inside of Congress. But unfortunately, after the U.S.-Mexican War, a whole new territory comes into the United States, known as the Mexican Cession. And if you remember, all that territory was gained to the US, but lost by Mexico. And because of different circumstances like the gold rush, many people are moving out west, completing that manifest destiny, going to the other side, and they are building up that population. Eventually, California gets a huge population because of the gold rush and because of the opportunity of trade and building the railroad. Eventually, we start to see that California wants to become part of the United States. But because they want to be a free state, that kind of throws things off, because you got to remember that 3630 line runs straight through California. So it begins to be a problem where now it's not going to be even inside of Congress, because there's no way to go ahead and add another state. So Henry Clay comes in, and he comes up with another idea. And that idea is, okay, California is going to come in as a free state, but there's going to be other stipulations. This law, or this compromise, has 5 laws. And the 2 main things that you need to remember about these laws is the Fugitive Slave Law Act is basically rewritten and fortified more to help the Southerners keep slavery. So California comes in as a free state. That's the law number 1. The next law is the Fugitive Slave Law Act, which basically states that any slave that was able to escape and go to the north and become free, because slavery is not practiced there, these southern states, plantation owners or slave owners can go and reclaim those people or the slave that escaped and bring them back. It also states that people are not allowed to help slaves escape. And it basically allows slavery throughout all the United States, kind of fortifying the institution of slavery. It doesn't matter whether you're in the North or the South. So this obviously was a great compromise, according to the Southerners, because it just protected their institution of slavery and their economy. The other parts of the compromise are going to be fortifying the Texas border, and then looking at the different territories of New Mexico and the other parts of the Mexican Cession, where they're going to be able to decide whether those territories will come in as slave or free by popular sovereignty, which means they are going to vote. So that is basically the whole idea of the Compromise of 1850, as well as outlawing the selling of slaves in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. So those are the 5 points of the Missouri Compromise. And this just made everyone happy, but not for long, because again, we're going to see other territories of Louisiana Purchase are going to want to come into the United States. And many of those states, if you think about it, are above that 3630 line. So it's not going to work too well. So let's go ahead and let's take a look. So this is that map that I was explaining you about. So that Compromise of 1850, we're seeing these territories, the Utah and New Mexico territory, they are going to be open to slavery by popular sovereignty. California was going to come in as a free state. The border of Texas was fortified as what we see here along the Rio Grande. And then we start to see these territories here. It is now in Washington, D.C. that slavery is illegal. To go ahead and sell slaves. And then from here, the Fugitive Slave Law Act, any slave that was able to escape to get to the free states was allowed to be reclaimed. Okay, so that is basically the Compromise of 1850. As we continue, we begin to see this abolitionist movement where the North is really against that whole idea of slavery. And we start to see it inside of literary works. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, she is a author inside from Connecticut who is big on women's rights, as well as fighting for African Americans to be free. And she's a huge abolitionist, but she's more with her literary works. So she writes this novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And basically what we're starting to see, it's a powerful novel that basically helps create more ideas of the North disliking slavery. So the whole point of this literary work is that the novel served as a response to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law Act, which was basically showing how horrible slavery was. And if you remember the Fugitive Slave Law Act, it basically was Southerners or slave owners were able to go ahead and recall their escaped slaves into slavery. Okay, the novel follows a story of a slave named Tom and the hardships that he has faced. The book was a bestseller, and when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe for the first time, he said to her, "So this is the little lady who made this big war." So what is it that he means by that? He's basically explaining how this book shows what's going on in the South with slavery. And it just created more of a want of the Northerners to go ahead and eliminate slavery in the South because of all the atrocities that were happening. So this is just kind of what this book did. It just created that want to eliminate slavery. So creating and strengthening the abolitionist movement. So you could just imagine how upset the South was of that. So the KansasNebraska Act comes in. If you remember, Kansas and Nebraska is basically in the Louisiana Purchase area, where the Louisiana Territory. And what we start to see is 3630 is that line. Nebraska and Kansas are above that. So they would have to come in as slave states. But a lot of the people are not happy about this because they feel that it's not fair, because now the tip inside of Congress is going to be the Northerners being higher and in charge, and the Southerners aren't liking this already. And if you remember, the tariff system has already been placed that's hurting the Southerners, and now they're going to go ahead and be able to lose slavery, and that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid that with that happening, they're going to lose their institution of slavery that supports their economy. So Stephen Douglas comes in and he basically says, okay, let's go ahead and let's leave this up to popular sovereignty. Let's let the voters decide how they want to come in. So there are two things that happen here. One, the Missouri Compromise is completely null and voided. It's no longer there because according to the Missouri Compromise, Nebraska and Kansas would be free states. But now that has been voided and popular sovereignty is going to happen. So to go ahead and try and win this, many Southerners and many Northerners rush into these territories to go ahead and settle to be able to vote to see whether Kansas or Nebraska is going to go ahead and become a slave state or a free state. Now, just think about how this is picturing. You have people that already don't like each other because of their culture, their belief, their lifestyle, and they're going to put them all together in one territory. You could imagine what's going to happen, and it's going to be complete chaos. They both started fighting over, and we start to see that the pro-slavery wins the election, but the anti-slavery, which is the Northerners, didn't really believe it. They thought it was a lot of fraud going on. And what they figured was fraud was illegal voting. People were coming over into the territory and voting even though they didn't live there. So it created two legislators to go ahead and exist in these territories, but it eventually leads to complete and utter violence. People are dying, they're hurting each other, and it gets the name Bleeding Kansas because of all the violence that came on. So now we're starting to see the tension between the North and the South, which was cordial, has now passed that line and is now leading to violence. And this violence is not just in these territories, it's starting to happen all over the United States, even in Congress itself. So just kind of think about that. So as we move on, we start to go ahead and take a look at Congress starting to also see that. So the beating of Charles Sumner. So Charles Sumner is a Massachusetts senator, and Preston Brooks is from the South. And what happened was Senator Sumner gave a speech declaring that Kansas should not be admitted to the Union as a slave state. And the Congressman Brooks was so upset and so offended that he went and grabbed his cane and bashed it over Sumner's head. So that just goes to show you that the differences between the two has gotten to the point where everyone's resorting to violence, which you can see is very dangerous at that time. And you can see how it really offends each one and why the Civil War basically breaks out. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. The compromises are not happening anymore. If the best way to explain it is you're putting band-aids over bullet holes, it's just not going to hold. It's just going to end up being a catastrophe. So the Dred Scott decision basically comes in, and again, think about that Fugitive Slave Law Act about, justifying slavery. So what we start to see here is Dred Scott, he followed his master into the North where he lived, but because he was there, he was still going to be a slave. His master died, and Dred Scott decided to take his freedom to the court system. So he went to court to go ahead and apply for his freedom because he's been basically living as a free man for such a long time. But as they went to court, the Supreme Court dealt with the anti-slavery forces as a blow, because the Dred Scott decision basically said that it did not matter about Dred Scott living in the free states. Even though he was living in the free states, his owner brought him as a slave, and he is a slave, and there's nothing that can be done from it. So the court ruled that African Americans were not citizens. So they didn't just say he was not a slave, they just used his court or his example, and they used them as an example, saying all African Americans are slaves, okay, and therefore could not be or they're not citizens. So I'm sorry, that they are not citizens of the United States, which means they cannot go ahead or sue or use the court system in the United States. And the court ruled that Congress could not ban slavery in any federal territory. Now, this basically justifies slavery inside the South as well as in all of the United States, that even if a slave goes to a free state, he is still a slave and not a citizen. And this obviously anchors the North because, again, they're seeing that, slavery is bad, and the abolitionist movement is starting to gain more people to want to go ahead and stop this. And then eventually it leads to a lot of radicals wanting to end slavery and basically start a lot of riots. And that's kind of what we start to see as we get closer to when the Civil War begins. So as we continue on about that radicalism, and this is kind of one of them, Harpers Ferry with John Brown's raid. So a raid is when you take people and you go ahead and rush in something, you rush in there by force. So in 1859, this is about 1 to 2 years before the Civil War starts, John Brown, who was a white abolitionist, an abolitionist is someone who is for anti-slavery. They do not like slavery. So he launched a slave revolt in Harpers Ferry. And what he did is he planned to spark slave uprisings, basically to get the slaves to go ahead and go against their masters and just basically break free and cause havoc. And what he did, the uprising was quickly crushed as slaves in the area of Harpers Ferry, Virginia, didn't join because they were afraid. You need to remember, these people that were inside the slavery institution were treated horribly, and they were afraid, what if I lose? And then they saw the Dred Scott decision, the Fugitive Slave Law Act, and they're like, how far is this really going to get us? The country is not even for us. So a lot of them really didn't go, and it just left John to go ahead and go with a bunch of other Americans to go ahead and raid. So Brown was seen as a hero to many in the North. But to the South, he was seen as a terrorist. Okay, his act of violence also demonstrated to many that the slave question had brought the country to the verge of civil war, which meant the South felt they were the victims. They were just doing what they do in a normal life, and this is how they live. And they felt that their lifestyle was under attack, and they just didn't understand because they've never put any violence on the North. and besides kind of what happened at Kansas, Nebraska. So we're starting to see the South felt completely victimized, and they were just like, this is just going to get worse. And if we don't leave, it's just going to become chaos. And that's kind of what fortifies the South to think about leaving the Union. And as we begin to see in 1860, there was a huge election going on. And this election is just very simple. We're seeing we have the Republican Party, and then you have the Anti-Federalist Party. And we start to see that the Republican Party, who is being led by Lincoln, has similar views to the North, where he supports the tariff system. He doesn't really like slavery, and he is basically opposed at this time by Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas is known as just being, he's from the North as well, but he's not like big on, the slavery component, even though slavery and the tariff system were the big platforms in this election. And Lincoln was very, very clear that he did not like slavery, where Stephen Douglas was like, whatever, I'm okay with whatever works and keeps the country together. So the South really kind of liked Stephen Douglas, whereas they didn't like Lincoln. But Lincoln ran a really aggressive campaign, and because of many Northerners, you got to remember, there are more Northerners in the population than there are in the Southern population. So just to kind of give you an idea, there are more slaves in the South than there are American citizens. So the North obviously, decides who becomes that idea of president, and Lincoln wins, and the South freaks out, and they just can't believe it. So what happens is the South feels like that's the nail in the coffin. They're done. They do not trust Lincoln, and so they decide to secede. So the split in the party allowed Lincoln to win the election with only 39% of the popular vote. So just kind of think about that is like the nail in the coffin that separates the North and the South, and basically allows the South to leave. Okay, so Texas and the election of 1860, very simple. The result of the election caused Southern states to begin to secede, South Carolina being the first one, and then others to follow after. Sam Houston was pro-slavery. He urged Texas not to secede, but the voters of Texas did not listen to Texas, and they seceded in February of 1861. Okay, record of this information of the election of 1860 is just basically there. And South Carolina is like the leading of the seceding, and then eventually the start of the Civil War in 1861. So just kind of go through, take a moment to think about how this is going to affect which events are going to make the South upset, are going to make the North upset, and basically solidify the South to secede from the Union in general, to go ahead and start the Civil War. Just remember, the North, or you could say Lincoln, he's not trying to end slavery. He's trying to keep the Union together. And then if slavery is able to be abolished during that time, that is a bonus. The South, they left not because of slavery, they left because they felt that their lifestyle was just not being supported or being protected by a country that was supposed to protect them. And so they felt they would just be better off on their own. And so they started the Confederate States of America. Okay, so that is basically what I'm showing here with the election of 1860. And as you can see, majority of the northern states are voting for Lincoln, which ends up to be about 59%. And then you see right here the other different people that are coming in, and Douglas just basically taking Missouri, and then Breckinridge taking the South. But unfortunately, they didn't have as many points. Take a look at these points. So North Carolina had 10, Georgia had 10. But if you go to the North, take a look at these electoral votes. Pennsylvania had 27. New York had 35. I mean, just with these two states right there, it basically causes an automatic win because of the electoral votes, because those states have a bigger population than the South does. Okay, so I hope that basically explains what's going on, and it allows you to understand why the Civil War breaks out. Well, that's all I have for you today. Go watch this again if you need it. Other than that, I will see you later.